Have you ever caught a neighbor secretly using your utilities? When I bought my new house in the capital, I knew I was taking over a property that had been sitting untouched for almost 3 years. The previous owners were family friends who had left the country mid-renovation and urgently needed money, so I got the place at a price nobody could complain about. But because it had basically been abandoned for years, the neighborhood had formed some very bad habits. On my first day there, I walked into what was supposed to be my new garage and found a stranger's motorbike parked as if he owned the place. There wasn't even a proper door lock, just a padlock, and the property had no gate, so anyone could stroll right in. I pushed the bike out to the road, installed a gate that same afternoon, and didn't think much about it until an angry man started pounding on the gate later that evening. I stayed quiet and watched through the window as he eventually took the bike and left. Not exactly the warmest welcome. Still, after that, things stayed calm. The only issue was people constantly blocking my gate because they assumed the house was still empty. A no parking sign solved that quickly. For a while, I thought maybe I had judged the neighborhood too fast. Then one evening in the shower, I noticed my water pressure drop. Nothing dramatic, just off enough to make me pay attention. At the same moment, I heard the water pump from my next door neighbor's place kicking on. Now, this neighbor was already known for complaining to the previous owners about the sale, and he clearly wasn't thrilled that I had moved in. He lived on the ground floor, while the upper 2 floors were rented out to tenants, which meant he relied on a pump to get water up to their tanks. The pressure in my house returned to normal the moment his pump shut off. That got my mind turning. Over the past few years, even when the house was empty, the water bills were strangely high. The previous owners assumed it was due to some leaks, but the numbers never really added up. Suddenly, it made perfect sense. I started testing things. Turn on a tap when his pump was running. Pressure dropped. Wait for his pump to shut off. Pressure normal again. I couldn't see exactly where he had connected, but at that point I didn't need to. I was convinced he had tapped into my line somewhere on the property while it sat empty. For a few days, I debated what to do. Water is incredibly cheap where I live. Even with heavy use, 3 dogs, regular car washes, gardening, I barely pay $5 a month. But this wasn't about the money. It was about a neighbor helping himself to something that wasn't his, just because he thought he could get away with it. So I decided to handle it in a way that didn't require breaking in, arguing, or dealing with legal drama. I waited for the next time his pump switched on. Then I simply turned off my main water valve. In our system, the rooftop tanks use a ball valve that detects water levels. When the level drops, the valve opens and signals the pump to fill it. If no water comes in, the pump keeps running endlessly, waiting for a level that never rises. It's terrible for the pump, and apparently terrible for old house wiring too, something I didn't expect. At around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of people arguing next door. The entire house had lost both water and electricity. The tenants were furious, shouting at their landlord through the stairwell about why only their building had gone dark. I later learned that the continuous draw from the pump overloaded their outdated wiring and blew multiple fuses, knocking out their power completely. In my country, water and electricity are classified as essential services. If a landlord allows them to fail due to poor maintenance, the tenants can immediately file complaints. And that's exactly what they did. 2 separate reports, 2 separate investigations, and 2 very unhappy tenants who had been relying on that house for stability. By midweek, one tenant had already moved out. The other handed in notice right after the authorities confirmed the landlord would be fined. He now had to pay around $500 in penalties, return both deposits, repair the wiring, and fix the water system before he could rent the units again. That was money he didn't have. A couple of days later, he came to my gate and asked, very calmly, if I had turned off my water. I told him I discovered a leak and shut it off overnight until the plumber arrived. His face stayed neutral, but the silence said everything. He's now packing to move in with his daughter because he can't afford to stay on his own. And next week, I'm having my plumber remove every unnecessary line leaving my property, so nothing like this can happen again. One turn of a valve solved my problem, exposed his hidden connection, and cleared out a neighbor who would have caused nothing but trouble later. Sometimes the simplest moves do the most damage, without you having to lift anything heavier than a tap.